Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Dr. Emily Splichal is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out her first appearance on episode 305 of Boundless Body Radio. Dr. Emily Splichal, podiatrist and human movement specialist, is the mind behind Naboso. With a spirit to challenge conformity, Dr. Splichal has taken her conventional podiatric medical degree and combined it with years of experience and expertise in human movement and sensory science to found her company, Naboso. Dr. Splichal believes that our experience in this world is built around sensory stimulation and highly values our ability to process, perceive, and integrate this information effectively. Since 2012, Dr. Splichal has been traveling the world to share her unique approach to human movement, foot function, and barefoot science. Having taught in 35 countries and to 20,000 professionals, Dr. Splichal has quickly become a global leader in barefoot training and movement. She is also the author of the highly rated book, Barefoot Strong: Unlock the Secrets to Movement Longevity. Dr. Splichal's passion is ready to impact the world and share her passion for the belief that life is sensory. Dr. Emily Splichal, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Such a pleasure to have you back on. I have to tell you that since you were kind enough to send me my ball and my splay on my toes, your splay has made it on every single episode of Boundless Body Radio. I wear it every time when I
Yeah.
record or I'm coaching somebody. They feel so wonderful. You did a great job with the product.
Thank you so much. I love to hear that.
You also, like I said, you sent me the ball, the neuro ball, which I absolutely love. And I have to admit something to you. When you and I chatted, you talked a lot. You mentioned this in our conversation like 2 or 3 times, how important the texture of the ball was and why these little cones matter. And I remember thinking like, yeah, okay, that they matter. Sure, that's fine. Until I got these, and I use these also every single day. So when I'm editing my podcast, they're on the kitchen floor underneath my feet. I love them. My feet absolutely love to be on that texture. I really had no idea how important that texture was to this product. That's a complete game changer.
Yeah, no, it is. And we actually have patents around that texture, but the texture is very specific. And sometimes people, when they first see the Naboso products, they think it's kind of this random arbitrary knobbies that are on there, but it's a very specific 2-point discrimination is what it is. We tell people it's kind of like Braille. We're actually stimulating the same nerve in the foot that your fingers use to read Braille. So it really is Braille for your feet. And then that wakes up the nerves. We have people who have neuropathy and haven't felt their feet in like 10 years say, oh my gosh, once I started using Naboso, I can feel my feet again. And now, years later of doing this, I'm not surprised when it is. It's just because we're being very specific with the stimulus.
Well, it makes a big difference. And I catch myself every now and again. Like, I love how clever the ball is, how you can pull it apart and have 2 different pieces and they're half dome. So one for each foot, obviously. When I put it together, I'll find myself kind of rolling it on my hands or I'll like roll it up and down my arm. And I'm not doing that for any particular reason. I just catch myself, doing this, passing it back and forth. And like, it really makes a difference to feel that exact texture all over my skin. I like it.
It does. And honestly, when you think of like fidget toys, like fidget tools and things like that, like stress balls, really what they're doing is they are stimulating the nervous system. And by you fidgeting with something, you're stimulating joints, joint capsules, nerve endings. And that's part of what Naboso is doing as well. So they are great fidget toys as well.
That's awesome. That's a great, you should definitely market that as a fidget toy. I think that would increase sales. That's great. Last time we had you on, we had an amazing conversation all about the foot and foot health and something we could definitely deep dive and talk about as much as we wanted. I just found out that you've got another book coming out, which I really want to deep dive into as well. I think the movement and longevity movements, no pun intended, are really hot right now, and a lot of people are talking about them. And so really curious to hear about your new book. I wanted to get a little bit more of your kind of personal story. I've loved through the process of podcasting, meeting doctors, professionals, researchers, everyday people out there who are trained in a certain way about a certain thing. And they just, I don't know, they just don't like see a lot of success. They don't notice that it's like working really well. And they have to really go outside of what they're trained in to be able to find something that really gives their life like the meaning, the juiciness of life. And you're somebody who's definitely done that, but we haven't really gotten much into your own personal story about that. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, your conventional training, and why you decided to do something different?
Absolutely. So I think my background started as a competitive gymnast. So I was always into athletics, movement. It happens to be a barefoot sport. I think that was a little bit coincidental as far as why I'm into barefoot now, but I was into a barefoot body weight, body tension, fascial sport from a very early age. Then I got into the fitness industry, and fitness is very much about movement. Obviously, you're doing integrated complex exercises. So I did that. That was all before I started podiatry school. Then when I went to podiatry school, and if I take a step back and just say that podiatry is traditionally very it's a slow moving profession that has been taught in a similar way for years. And I'm East Coast trained. I went to school in New York City, which is a very traditional based podiatric education. There's some other podiatry schools in the US that are a little bit more forward thinking. They teach a little bit different. Medical schools are trying to be very forward thinking in how they teach just medicine in general, but that's an important part of it. So I came into it with this appreciation for movement. I kept training while in school. So when they started to teach us different things like stretches for plantar fasciitis, things like that, I was like, well, why is that the stretch that everybody is saying? Why does everyone have to go into a New Balance? Why does every patient that comes in, we try to sell them an orthotic? And I just started to kind of question and say, like, no, that's not the only way, because of what I was seeing and experiencing in the fitness industry and then being a gymnast and moving in a certain way. So I came in with this different appreciation for movement. So I just started to say, like, no, there are other things that we can give them. I don't need to just keep repeating the same thing. So long story short, went through the education. And then when I started residency, which is very surgical based, it became very, very conflicting to my internal beliefs. Because at this point, it was like, cut, cut, cut. Any person comes in, cut it, operate, surgery. You need surgery. There's no other solution except surgery. And I was like, but that's not true. There's these other things. But I was at the helm of being a resident, and I have to do so many surgeries to get certified, and you're kind of caught in this place. So I actually left residency, and not many people know this, that I quit residency and said, I don't think I can do this. This doesn't fit in my belief system. Left, went back to school, got my master's in human movement. And at that time, it was when the barefoot running boom was just hitting. This is 2009, 10, around that year. So I've put my focus to my master's degree into barefoot science and really looking at the neurological side of the foot, the fascial side of the foot, breath work, pelvic floor, just this whole other aspect that I didn't learn in fitness. And obviously I didn't learn in podiatry school. And it became the connector between my fitness background, my movement background, my medical degree, and then I had this master's in the middle. And I could start to see the connection or the bridge that I could bring between both of these. So I essentially had to go back to residency because I needed to get licensed. I'd spent $250,000 worth of student loans to become a doctor. I was like, I need to get licensed. So I had to go through it. I played the whole surgical game. I had to do all the surgeries, got licensed. And then in 2000, I started practicing in 2012. 2017, I stopped doing surgery, pulled away from conventional or traditional podiatry, started my Center for Functional and Regenerative Podiatry, and pulled out of insurances. And now I do what's called direct access. And I treat patients in a completely different way. And that's been since 2017. And part of me doing that is to then inspire more podiatrists or more professionals to question and to say there are other ways to do it. Here's part of my story. Here's how I did it. And then maybe I can inspire someone or help someone do the same thing.
That's savage. I love that. Okay, so give us an example. Somebody that goes to a more traditional podiatrist, what would be like a really common problem, like a problem with the arch or maybe plantar fasciitis or something? Can you take us through what somebody would expect if they stick with the traditional kind of system, what things they might be up against, how they might be treated versus somebody coming to you with the same condition? How would you look at things differently?
So I'll give an example of, let's say, chronic heel pain or chronic ankle pain, and it is showing that there is partial tearing, fraying, or degeneration in a tendon or the plantar fascia, let's say. So they are told by a traditional podiatrist that this is a chronic condition. There's nothing that you can do except surgery. You need to go into stiff, rigid shoes with custom orthotics, and you need to be there, and you can never play tennis, pickleball, run, whatever again. And let's say they're 45. That's very, very it makes me emotional thinking about that, because movement is my passion. I have to be able to go to the gym or I go crazy. So I understand the mental side of movement for my patients, for everyone in general, that the pickleball that someone plays every day with their friends when they're 60 is part of their their light of every day of why they wake up, right? So I can't take that away from them. So then I'll see these patients and say, that's not true. One, I do regenerative injections. I will take them through this regenerative model of red light stem cells, systemic enzymes. I immobilize them, then I try to return them back to strength and a little bit better tissue integrity so that they can then play their sport or run again or whatever it is. Or I guide them into maybe certain shoes that will support it so they can still run. But I never tell a patient either you will not be able to do that ever again, just accept it. And I never tell a patient, I don't know. And the number of patients that I get where a doctor says, I don't know why you have your pain. And they literally shrug their shoulders and are like, I don't know, live with it. What? Like that, I would say, okay, this is beyond my expertise. So I'm going to have you see a fascial stretch therapist. I'm going to have you see someone in NKT. I'm going to have you see someone in muscle activation technique. I'm going to have you see a neurologist. I'm going to do some imaging. I'm going to try to reach out to any sort of alternative approach or advanced medical approach to try to get them some answers so that it's not just, I don't know. You just have to live with it.
Yeah. Wow. The orthotic in particular, that's all you hear is that, yes, you have to use this, but yes, you can't use anything else. And you're going to have to use this for the rest of your life. I think they must serve some function, but the way I explain it to some of my clients is if I broke my arm, I would need a cast, and that would be really helpful to have that cast, but I'm not going to keep the cast on for the rest of my life. Can we think about it in that way, or is that oversimplifying it too much?
I mean, you can, however, so let's say in the case of someone who has a tear in their post-tib tendon, and the post-tib runs along the inside of the foot, inserts onto the arch. So it's a very important arch stabilizer. Let's say they have a tear there. So they're getting a flat foot, maybe it's on one side and it's quite moderate. They may need the orthotic because they've lost some of their connective tissue integrity. But I don't just say, you need to use this for the rest of your life. That's what it is. And just accept it and stop running. I try to really explain, and I explain to the patient and I say, okay, this is how we stabilize the foot. You have this ligament right here. You have this tendon. You have your intrinsics. You have your bone. And then just at the rate of acceleration of running and how your foot strikes the ground, you're essentially just bottoming out this connective tissue. That's why you need the mechanical support of the orthotic. So I'm not just saying you need this, just accept what I say because I have the white jacket and letters behind my name. Therefore, you should just listen to what I say. I try to get them to understand why that's my recommendation and why they need it. And if we're consistent about staying in something like a custom orthotic and you're consistent and your pain level stays low, you can start to break the rules a little bit, right? So you got a fancy event, you got a wedding, you can get out of those, you can break the rules, you can be barefoot in your home. But as soon as you do something higher load, I need you back in that orthotic. And this is how and to me, I consider it a form of empowerment. I'm trying to empower my patients to understand their body, to understand their injury, to understand when and how they could break the rules a little bit, to live a little. I mean, I don't know if it's how I was raised, but I definitely have a carpe diem, YOLO. I don't know, but I'm just like, you got to live, right? So I'm trying to empower you to live in the most satisfying way and not feel like you have to be in a bubble because you have a torn tendon and you can't do anything fun because you only live once.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. Our work kind of generally takes us a little bit more into nutrition space than anything. And a lot of what we talk about on the show is nutrition. And just being at this conference this last weekend, this symposium for metabolic health, you're with all these people who have reversed bipolar or they have, fixed severe depression or anxiety. And you hear the same message from them that like my doctor told me to take a bunch of pills, they didn't work, I felt terrible, I gained a bunch of weight. They feel helpless, completely helpless. And yet alternate messages like yours and others in the nutrition world get out and people are actually getting fixed. You realize how important the empowerment and the hope side of things is to provide hope for your patients. It's so crazy how little of it there is out there. Once you tell somebody you have a chronic condition, it's only going to get worse and there's nothing you can do about it. Here's your orthotic, pay the bill on the way out. You know what I mean? I'm really glad you mentioned that empowerment is like a key part of what you're trying to do.
100%. And patient advocacy, that I'm very much into a patient to ask why, right? Like, why is that? Is that the only option? Why am I not doing this? Is there anything else alternatively? What if I do this, right? And they to push because just the way that the healthcare system insurances have shifted is that the doctor with the white jacket can't advocate for them in the same way because they're on their own pressures from the insurance companies to like get the patients in and out. So patient advocacy, self-advocacy, and patient empowerment is very much what I stand behind.
I love that. That's amazing. Well, before we got on the call, I've learned that you have written a new book. Please tell us about it. I had no idea.
Yes, so I have a book coming out, date TBD, but it is all about how modern movement is actually aging us and that we have to go back to and understand how were we designed? How was our nervous system designed to stand and move? And it's really based around my passion, which is sensory stimulation. And we have to better connect to our environment, sight, sound, touch, vibration, texture, joints, skin stretch, compression, all of these stimuli. And then we also have to connect to our internal environment, which is your breath, your heart beating, digestion. So everything internally and externally to then really feel our body in space so we can move the right way. I just feel that we are from head to toe sensorially disconnected from ourselves and from each other. And that is actually aging us. The depression rates, autism rates, cognitive decline, like a lot of that stuff goes back to sensory stimulation. How much? What's the quality? Did you get it daily? And it's really simple stuff that you can do to just reintroduce all these different sensory stimuli into your day to support your movement, which supports longevity.
I love that. When you say modern movement, what exactly do you mean when you say modern movement? Do you mean the yoga class that we go take, at 6 a.m, or what do you mean when you say modern movement? And how is that different from the movement we would have evolved with, like you said, sitting, standing, walking, ambulating, brachiating, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the movement that I'm going to focus on, that I love to focus on, is walking. And the way that we walk now, in the 2020 decade is very different than the way that we were initially walking, where we were barefoot in the wild. We were hunting, gathering, taking very long steps. I'm sure they finagled something as far as carrying stuff, but now on concrete surfaces with shoes, with cushion, with kind of the modernization of society, footwear, fashion, things like that is very different from how we were initially moving. If we just think of walking just a little bit deeper, is the pace at which we walk now is very different. We walk in these short little staccato steps. The way that we walk around our home, from our car to the grocery store, from like around the office, everything is very, very different. And I can kind of relate to it or share stories as far as when I lived in New York City, which is a walking city. And that's of a great advantage as far as how it feeds the fascial system, the joints, the brain. You have to walk at a certain pace to get sufficient blood flow to the brain to stimulate brain-derived neural growth factor for the brain. So that's very cognitive protective, is to walk at a certain pace. So when I would travel around teaching, I would go to Asia and just around the world for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at a clip. So I would be standing and lecturing. Then I would walk to my hotel room, and I just really wouldn't be doing my normal movement as when I lived in New York City. Come back 3, 4 weeks later, I am stiff, my back hurts, my body, I just feel like just restricted. After like a day or two being back in New York City, walking 20,000 steps a day, I walk really fast, mind you, like really fast, good arm swing where you can feel the momentum riding through your body. And it's not like you're in muscle, you are now just in this momentous fascial movement. I would feel that as soon as I come back to New York, and boom, all of my stiffness, my back pain would just like melt away. And I knew that it was because of how I was walking in New York City, because I had the space to do it and the distance to be able to do it. So to me, it's very therapeutic to walk the right way, to walk the way that we were designed to walk, which is long strides with beautiful arm swing, with your rib cage rotating, your pelvis rotating, getting this rocker effect through the foot, because it's just so hydrating to the system and very circulatory inducing.
Yeah, I love that. My wife and I both notice a difference on days where we just can't go get as many steps as we normally like. You feel a little crummy. You don't feel as good as the days that you're outside and getting those good steps outside. You mentioned the foot and the shoe. I have to ask you when you're on our show, barefoot shoes. Why do they make such a big difference versus a conventional shoe? What are some of the features of a conventional shoe that you just absolutely despise?
Yes, so think of traditional shoe, pick a brand, doesn't matter, but there is structure to it. You have a heel counter. A heel counter is the back of the shoe, that it's the part that hugs the heel bone of the calcaneus. A lot of them have stiff counters that are made of plastic or a hard cardboard. Some of them will have an actual shank that runs through the midsole. And you can tell by, if you take a shoe, the listeners can grab any sneaker or shoe that they have. And if you can twist it like a rag, so you're kind of spiraling the shoe, if you can do that in a shoe, that means it doesn't have that midsole going through it, which is allowing you to unlock movement. As soon as you put a stiff midsole through a shoe, it essentially just moves in this flexion point of the toes, and it just pushes you forward, when our foot actually has this spiral in it. Traditional shoes also have more of a stack. So stack is cushion. So how high off of the floor are you? Think like a Hoka. Hoka has a lot of stack. You are high off of the ground with a lot of cushion in between. Think of that as just sensorily disconnecting you from the information of the ground. And then a lot of them will have a narrower toe box, and they have a drop. And the drop is what's from the heel down to the toe. All of that support and structure and stiffness was initially designed for certain foot types. Certain foot types benefit from these different features. A majority of feet benefit from the sensory stimulation of no cushion, having a zero drop or a minimal drop shoe, wide toe box, a shoe that you can twist like a rag, so there's no midsole shank, there's no counter, it is freely flexible, and it's allowing your foot to move in the way that it was designed.
I love that. That was so very well explained. It was a painful day to throw away all my old traditional shoes. Very expensive to do, but my feet have never been happier being on minimal or no footwear. It's pretty amazing the difference. Going back to the activity walking, why was it walking that you identified as like the one kind of movement that stands out? I always reflect, like the Olympics just ended a few weeks ago, and I see these humans, gymnastics, and there's running and swimming and cycling and so many different events and body types, and we can do such a wide variety of different movements, really generalists as a species. Why was it walking that you got to as like, this is kind of where the good stuff is at versus some of the other things we can do as humans?
Absolutely. So the most foundational functional movement that we do every day and that your nervous system is based around is walking. And if you think of newborn baby going through all of these developmental milestones, they're motor milestones. Those motor milestones are essentially bringing the newborn baby to the point of walking. That's what we're looking at, right? So they're slowly introducing and lifting into the neck, and they start to shape the spinal curves through these different postures that the baby will sit in and arch their back, and then they sit up, etc. And they are starting to stimulate and create a relationship with gravity. And that's literally everything. Is the better that you can be tuned into gravity, and this is all subconscious, but we need to optimize our relationship to gravity and then how we move in gravity. Talking about the Olympics, Simone Biles is such a talented gymnast because her body perception in relation to gravity when she is spinning in space is higher than most other gymnasts. So she can twist and backflip at the exact same time. Well, I was a gymnast and I would be like, where the hell am I? Like so she has a very, very good tuned in calibration system visually, vestibularly, proprioceptively, mechanoceptively. She would be like the dictionary photo of body perception is someone who can move like that. We all need that. And then we use that relationship with gravity to do the most foundational movement, which is walking. And then from walking, we extrapolate into these other movements, running, jumping, flipping, etc. So that's really why I look at that. The neurodevelopmental component of gravity and walking.
Yeah, interesting. One of my favorite books is a book written maybe a decade ago called Go Wild. John Rady, I can't remember who his co-author was, but they have an example in the book that always stood out to me where one person is going to the gym, they get on the treadmill, whether they were jogging or walking, I can't really remember. And you get on the treadmill and CNN is in front of you with like the worst headlines of everything that's going wrong in the world. And you just kind of like plod along on this treadmill. And it contrasts that with another guy out on either walk or jog. And he's outside, he's on a trail, he's in minimal shoes, and the colors and the textures of the ground. He's constantly evaluating what's wet, what's slick, what's dry. He's got a dog with him. So they're doing this kind of together. And you just obviously get a great sense of like, yes, you can move in a certain way inside and with equipment or whatever, but it's so different than the way we used to move in other environments. You're talking about the sensory. Oh my goodness, there must be a vast, vast difference being outside and moving outside versus being inside in the gym.
100%. I mean, the benefit of being in nature, huge. And there's lots of research around spending X amount of time in nature, what it can do for like cancer prevention and things like that. That is incredible. There was another study that was done that looked at trail runners that were in traditional shoes and then trail runners that were in barefoot shoes or minimal shoes. And they saw that the memory recall, the short-term memory after trail running with minimal shoes is much higher. And that's because you have to be very present. You're paying attention. You're not kind of oblivious to your movement and your foot strike and your foot contact. So there's so many benefits to what we're talking about.
That's amazing. I can see it when I'm at the park. I can see somebody across the park from me. If they're in barefoot shoes, their upper body posture is so different. I can identify it, and sure enough, when they come back around and pass me as I'm walking and they're running, they're in barefoot shoes. You can see it in the upper body, the way that it moves when they're in minimal shoes.
Yeah, 100%. We need to increase perception of our feet, of our body, of ourself, of our posture, and any product, company, tool, method, podcast that brings an awareness to that is really, really important because I mean, that's just everything, right? Is how you sit, how you stand, how you move affects everything moving forward.
Gotcha. When you're starting to work with somebody, how do you work into work with your clients and your patients with better walking techniques? Like what kinds of things do you really want somebody to focus on if they're just starting to bring this into their consciousness?
Yes. So what I like people to understand is that in order to walk the right way, you have to be able to take long enough steps. So walking speed is directly correlated to step length, which means we have to have this awareness. But do you even have the joint mobility to take a long step? In order to take a long step, you have to have flexibility or mobility in your big toe, your ankle, your pelvis, and your T-spine. So I teach different mobility methods, exercises that will essentially unlock those different areas at the exact same time. So pelvis and T-spine together in all three planes. Then I like people to understand that walking is very spiral. I see, and I don't know if this analogy helps anyone, but if you've ever seen on a train, do you know how the wheels are attached to each other? There's like a thing, a bar that
Yeah.
attaches the wheels, and then it
Yeah.
kind of moves around like this.
Yep.
So to me, that's how I see, and of course, this is for people who are just listening. It is not helping in any way, but just picture a train tire moving down a track and the tires are connected to each other by a bar, right? So we think of walking as this sagittal hinge movement, but really what's happening is there are all of these beautiful spirals that are going up. And those spirals are, it starts from the top and it starts from the bottom, and they essentially come and then they meet in your spine and they cancel each other out. So it's I try to get people to feel that there's a rhythm and a spirality and a fluidity to walking. It's not hinged sagittal mechanics of how we walk. I used to teach, as a random aside, models how to walk in high heels.
Nice.
I would have them, they would have to find the rhythm of walking in heels, right? Walking, regardless of it being heels, minimal, barefoot, whatever it is you have to find the fluidity and the flow of walking, similar to a dance if you're doing like a salsa or whatnot. So I'd have them put on music that supports that fluidity, rhythmic movement, and try to find the rhythm of walking. Treadmill walking is good in the sense that you can hear the rhythm of the belt. And I've actually taught a couple blind professionals how to do a gait assessment by listening to gait.
Wow.
And you can hear, and it's fascinating, you can hear differences of how one foot versus the other may strike the surface of the treadmill, how you're on one foot longer than the other. So that I just encourage the listeners to try to play with the fluidity or the rhythm of it. And then the next time that you're on a treadmill, or if you're doing an assessment, just try to hear the music or the sound of gait.
That's good advice. I really like that. You mentioned stride length and the speed of walking. How does somebody know where that optimal kind of length is, where that optimal speed is? In my mind, I would think if my stride were going out too far, I would be heel striking again. And I mean, it's hard to do in barefoot shoes. It'd be quite uncomfortable, but that's what my mind would go to if I was overstriding. How does somebody know where they're in their optimal gait?
So we're talking about walking here. So just walking. Running is going to be a little bit different. So running is not just this continuation of walking. And I think that that's important for the listeners to understand, that you really can't compare them next to each other. It's like apples and oranges. So let's just talk about walking for a moment. So walking is very much based around momentum. It's often described as a series of falls. There's actually a pendulum theory to gait, walking gait, and your leg as it swings forward is kind of like a pendulum that's weighted, that will tip you forward and you fall, strike the ground, absorb potential energy. It loads into your fascial system. When your leg is behind you, you're essentially pulling like a bow and arrow. You're potentiating your Achilles tendon, which is where most of your recoil comes from. You slingshot it forward, a leg comes forward. Again, it's a pendulum, it's weighted. It makes you fall forward again, you strike the ground and you repeat. So just knowing that's an important part of it. This momentum, that is our ideal walking pace. Mine is very different than yours, which is very different than my boyfriend's, which is different than my daughter's. Everyone's is going to be different based off of your height, your leg length, your fascial, your elasticity, all of that. But you will know as soon as you feel this lightness, that you are now no longer using muscular energy to walk. This is where my New York City story is important, because I would feel that. And I would feel when I would get into a moment and it would just be like light. And I could feel like I'm just falling one step into the next. And I'm at a pace and I'm at this momentum that I was like, if anyone walks in front of me, I can't slow myself down because there's so much momentum behind my pace that I would just like barrel into them. And that's the sweet spot of where you want to be, is that you will feel the difference in your fashion, how you're moving. Now, if I try to take longer steps to keep up, my boyfriend's 6'5", and I'm 5'2", so that's very not going to happen. But if I'm taking these very long steps, my work efficiency becomes very, very low. I'm working way harder than my body wants to, right? And when we walk, this is important. When we walk, we do not want to burn a lot of calories. We want to be very efficient when we walk, because it's the means of how you hunt and you gather and you do things, right? It's a mean of transportation. So I can't be burning all my calories walking. It has to be very efficient. The more momentous you are, the more fascial you are, the more efficient you are. So if I try to take long steps to keep up with my boyfriend, my workload goes up, my efficiency goes down, I'm going to fatigue out. It's not sustainable. Similar though, this is important, is if he slows down to try to keep up with my pace, he's actually burning way more calories than he should, and the work goes up. So to slow down is just as deleterious as someone trying to keep up with someone else. And that's where your sweet spot is, kind of your unique one. And that's where I encourage people to either go out, walk in a wide space. If you're in New York, you should be out there doing that anyway. Go to the mall, like mall walkers. Love it. I don't like the concrete that they have to walk on, but mall walking, there's something to it, right? That they can get in this wide open space, go to your high school track and walk the track if you can, but find something that you can get in there and just push your pace just a little bit further so you can feel how you switch from muscle to fascia.
Wow, that was very, very well explained. That's, I think, the first time on our show anybody's talked about mall walking like that. It's amazing. I still remember going across the freeway with my mom and doing mall walking. I must have been like 8 or 10. I was not walking efficiently at my height, by the way. She was really fast. You don't mess around with Mormon mom walking people. They're really quick.
My mom, she's 5'1". She walks so fast. I think that's where I got it from. And I would so bad, but I used to wear high heels in New York. This is in the early 2000s during like the Sex and the City episode series or phase. And I would pass men. I was just like booking it in these 3-inch heels. And I would pass men who would then like speed up and be like, I have never been passed by a female, let alone someone in high heels. And I was like, that's right. So I just
That's
keep booking.
amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so I when I'm out walking, I typically will try to average. I don't always get it, but I try to average about 20,000 steps a day is kind of where I like to be. I'll take 10 as like a minimum. I really don't like to be under 10, but I always have my phone in my pocket. I'm always listening to a podcast. I have really tried to not to leave the phone home and just go on a walk. And I suck at it. I always want to be like listening to something. But my phone has the tracker. That's how I know how many steps I'm getting. It also knows the length of my stride. And as I was asking you the question, is there an ideal stride? I'm thinking about it in like numbers. Like I'm looking at a certain number for stride length in my phone. The way you're describing it, you don't need a tracker at all. I'm sure they're fine if somebody wants to use them, but what you're describing is something anybody can do and figure out for themselves where their optimal speed of walking is.
Yes. And the reason is because it goes back to the other part that we were talking about, is this perception. I want it to be less data driven, and I want it to be perceptually. I want you to tune into your body and feel the difference of how walking that pace versus that pace, right? That speed. And that's why it's very important for me to kind of say, well, how could we do this without the technology? And I'm all about like, I want my music to get me in a zone and kind of tune out. So I totally appreciate that. But how do we just feel that difference within our own body?
I love that. And then we talked about this a little bit last time, but surfaces that we walk on, does it matter? Hard surfaces, sidewalks, asphalt, grass, sand, like does that matter?
So concrete, artificial surfaces, the mall, those are obviously going to be very hard on the feet and on the body. So if you're wearing a pair of Vivo barefoot and you are doing a mall walk and you're walking fast, you might actually feel your foot. You might say like, ooh, my plantar fascia, like, what is that? And that's because concrete or these artificial surfaces do not vibrate naturally like dirt, grass, hardwood floors, tracks. So indoor tracks are actually really, really good. So if you can find a facility where you could do an indoor track, and that's where you do your walking and some of this therapeutic, momentous walking, that's a great option. Or just think about, okay, you're walking through the streets of New York City, doing your 20,000 steps, walking fast. You might need a little cushion in the shoe just to offset that artificial concrete. And if that's the case, and you understand that that's your reasoning, that's okay. Right.
Okay. Nice. Okay. And then I always get asked this question, and I have a certain answer to it, but like the amount of walking that somebody should be targeting. I think we all know 10,000 steps was a little bit arbitrary and it was kind of marketing, and it's not a bad number. I don't mind that as a number. It should be good. Most people are, I think the average is like 3,000, 4,000 steps for most American. It's crazy low. Do you have a set amount that you prescribe, or how do you tell somebody like, is there any amount of walking that's too much walking?
So I would say quality over quantity. That's just mine, that if you are getting a very sensorially rich 5,000, then kind of this disconnected, restricted staccato step of 15,000, then I would actually have better quality of them. So I try not to have it be, okay, at least do this. I get if you're trying to do it because you're trying to burn certain calories to lose weight. So that's really where the recommendation comes from. But if you are on a walking treadmill for your desk, like a standing desk treadmill, right? Like those are very different steps. I actually don't consider those part of the 20,000 steps. They're just movement to keep your fascial system and your joints hydrated as you are essentially working. So I try to keep quality over quantity.
I like that. Yeah, that's great. I'll tend to tell people like use reason, right? Like especially if you decide this is the week you're going to transition over to minimalist footwear, like don't go from like 4,000 to 20,000 like today. Not a great idea, but walking to me seems like one of the very few activities that it just seems linearly beneficial. Like as again, if you're being reasonable about it and you're not hurting yourself or doing a huge jump from what your typical is, if you can do a little bit more, it just always seems to be like a little bit more beneficial, like seriously like linearly beneficial.
100%. Yeah. And I've had many patients in New York who would have 20,000 by like noon because they were contractors or construction, and they would be kind of essentially assessing these large builds, and then they would come to me with foot pain. So I was like, okay, you need to make sure that you are balancing foot recovery. If you are going to be doing 20,000 steps plus, you still have to then, okay, what is the soft tissue work that I need to do to sustain that level of stress? Because yes, there's a linear benefit to walking more, but you eventually hit a stress threshold, like a tissue stress threshold. So what are you doing on the other side to make sure that you recover so you can do that 20, 30,000 the next day? And that's the part of the story that I think is less spoken about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not as sexy, right? Like we want to see the Olympics and the, Gatorade commercials where people are doing all this cool stuff, but we don't realize, all the recovery on the back end that is way less sexy. It's something you have to practice all the time. And that's why we love Naboso in particular and all the great tools that you make to help our feet feel amazing. The spacers and yeah, the texture items that they're all wonderful. So that's a really, really good point. Are there any other key concepts in your book that you write about that we haven't covered yet?
So I'm very big on connection to the internal environment, which is called interoception. The external environment is exteroception. So the perception of the external world and your relationship with the world around you. That's where most people think about what I talk about and what we've been speaking about. And then interoception is your perception and your relationship, your body's relationship with your internal environment. And that is some of this mind body that is spoken about, is connecting to your breath. Can you feel your heart beating? That's actually one of the best ways to assess your internal perception. Is, can you, if you were to sit here quietly with your eyes shut, could you feel your heart beating? And if you do, there's actually a little test that I'll share that the listeners can do on themselves. Is if you are sitting there, feet up flat on the floor, you're lying on your back, palms are facing up, eyes shut, and you just feel your heart beating, count how many heartbeats you feel in 15 seconds. Then stay exactly as you are, reach over, find your radial pulse. You actually feel your actual heart rate, count how many beats you feel in 15 seconds, and then you are comparing them. So how accurate is your perception to reality? And that's part of how I use that. And why I mention that is that people who have lower internal awareness, they're less aware of their heart beating. They don't really connect to the butterflies in their stomach. They don't feel the sensation of anxiety or aggression or whatnot kind of coming up until it's like a 10 out of 10. All of those are interoceptive. Typically, the lower the interoceptive awareness, connection to your internal environment, the less you are aware to your external environment, which to me means your posture, your movement. These are people who stand and they don't know that they're completely hunched over and they're looking at their phone like this, and they're just like so disconnected from their external body. And a lot of that means that they're disconnected from their internal self as well. I'm not an expert in any way to mental health and trauma and autonomic nervous system, but it's something that I do speak to my patients about. I have a great appreciation for polyvagal theory and fight or flight and balance and just that whole side of the nervous system, because it's part of your nervous system, and that's what I speak about as the nervous system. But how we need to bring connection to our physical body to bring this balance to our perception of safety and socialization and things like that. So that's mentioned in the book as well. And that's part of what I do discuss with my patients, because most of my patients are chronic. And anytime you have a chronic condition, there's always emotion involved.
I was just thinking when you were introducing that concept, it would be so difficult to disentangle the movement side of this and the physical with the spiritual and the mental and the emotional. And it's like in the basement where my wife works with myofascial tissue with people, we have, posters of all 7 of the anatomy trains, and we have an emotion wheel. And like, why would you have an emotion wheel in a place where you're working on tissue? Well, that for that person who's hunched over, they probably do have some kind of trauma that they went through. Childhood trauma, so common these days, and like protecting themselves and opening up space and fascial tissue all of a sudden puts you in different postures, like you said. And then the waterworks start, like trying to like identify different emotions. You almost can't like separate those two out. I love the way you talked about that.
Yeah, you can't. And I started getting into that around that 2017, probably even before that. I was very curious because I was seeing these chronic patients. And then I got my first major sports injury and was like floored. And then I had the doctors who were like, man, how's this? You don't fit the profile. It's not that injury. And that's part of my story of why I'm into patient advocacy as well, is because I was given the runaround as a female. I had sports hernia, athletic pubalgia. So I ruptured my rectus abdominis, and I did it cycling, which is a chronic tissue imbalance of what I experienced. But they were looking at it very stereotypical. They were like, you don't play hockey, you don't play soccer, you're not a competitive male athlete. And I was like, those are not the only people who get this injury. But I was essentially very much like, would not do anything athletics, had to have surgery. And I had a hard emotional time just in the pool, walking back and forth. And that's literally all I could do. And I'm just like, oh my God, what if I can't do sports again? This is my life. This is part of my identity. And it brought me to that. So I started looking at my patients with idiopathic neuropathy, with chronic ankle pain, with different other neuritises and things, and would just kind of be like, one, they just want to be heard. They want their chronic pain to be validated. And then let me try to navigate that emotional complexity while I'm guiding them to empower them about this diagnosis. So yeah, I've done a lot of like holotropic breathing. I've done lots of stuff to try to understand the trauma of certain things and how we can navigate it. And if you have an altered emotional relationship to an injury, you will never heal from that injury. And actually, you don't want to bring that energy into the OR, because I've had that where I'm just like, I'm very into that energy. I'm like, I need that surgeon I'm putting all good vibes. I have my 100% faith in you. You will do that. This is going to heal. It becomes a little like, not cheesy on that side, but I totally believe in that for tissue healing and energy and the surgeon and all that. So that's really where I started getting into this, and part of how I approach my patients, always first validating what they're coming to me with. I hear you. First half hour, I'm just listening to them and saying like, I hear you. What you have is not in your head. Like, I hear you, that what you're experiencing is valid.
Yeah, probably being listened to for the very first time if they've been mixed up in the medical community. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I love that advice. A few tips and tricks about breathing. It's one of our favorite things to talk about as well. Like, how do you help people breathe properly?
I'm very much into nasal breathing and not having the teeth touching when you're doing it. So I try to have the jaw relaxed. That I've learned from a craniosacral therapist on how that can actually stimulate the vagus nerve in a negative way and kind of trigger this fight or flight response from the teeth. So I have it jaw relaxed, tongue relaxed or behind the front teeth, breathing through the nose. Obviously, belly breathing, 3-dimensional breathing so that the belly's rising, the rib cage expands. I like to focus more on the exhalation and then have the inhale be essentially a response to the exhale. So what's driving you to inhale is the fact that you just extended your exhalation. So I love end range expiration breathing to like really lengthen out the exhalation. I use breath work as a way to wake up the pelvic floor, to wake up the foot to core connection, because your diaphragm is connected to your feet. So that's always how I weave in breathing, is that we're doing that. I like to do it standing in gravity, because ultimately that's where you have to end up, is upright in gravity. But yeah, all of my patients get something about breathing.
Yeah, and every breathing expert that we talk to seems to be less about it's exactly this protocol and this count, and a lot more of like, do whatever works for you, but do it and be consistent with it. If you have to do you use like mouth taping at night for some people?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's such a game changer to like really focus on that. And one thing that you said about the tongue placement is so critical as well. Like, I always heard that the tongue resting means it's down, it's at the bottom of the mouth, and that's absolutely not true. It should be behind the front teeth, creating that sill. Like you said, nobody knows that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just because, again, I use the breath to create stability. So I will often say that the breath is the driver to stability. So when I teach people to connect to their foot and their foundation, part of that is that the toes are pushing into the ground. And this is lightly, like I say that your toes are saying hello. Like, this is like 5% engagement. It's just like, hello, toes, right? Like, hello, ground, I feel you. But as your toes do that, that's actually where you want to be exhaling. And that's following fascial lines. That's following, in yoga, they call them bandhas. So you're essentially stacking the domes in the body, you're stacking bandhas. And I try to get people to also remember that everything is like a sinusoidal wave. Like, it kind of goes up, it crescendos and descends. So you're just kind of riding the wave versus it being like contract and then relax back down. I want it to be more fluid.
I have to say, I came into this conversation thinking I had gone, 40 years successfully knowing how to walk and how to breathe. And I'm coming away from this with a lot of amazing practical tips on how to do it just a little bit better. I think the listener is probably doing some of these things on their own, but if they're not, I think they've got a few really good things to be thinking about how to get started on this and make this very practical. I'm very much looking for your book to be coming out. Your first book is amazing and very beautiful, and I'm sure this will be as well. I have no idea how much work goes into writing books because I've never done one, but it seems like a lot. So congratulations on writing it. Like I said, I'm very excited to have that come out. In the meantime, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Absolutely. So I am on Instagram at the Functional Foot Doc. My podiatry site where I see patients in person in Arizona, but most of my patients are virtual. So I see patients all around the world. That is thefunctionalfootdoc.com. So that's easy for you. My book, Barefoot Strong, is on Amazon. And then for any of the Naboso products, that is naboso.com, Naboso. And then we're on Instagram, Naboso_technology.
Excellent. We will link all of that up in the show notes. It was a pleasure to catch up with you again. You are so good at taking these concepts and bringing them down to a level that people can understand. Your instructional videos have always been amazing. We definitely share those around with a lot of our clients. It's a real art to be able to not only like understand this stuff, but also communicate it really effectively. And you're just an absolute pro at doing that. So really appreciate you and all of your work, and really appreciate you taking the time to be on our show again today. We really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you so much. That was such a big compliment, so I really appreciate it.
Well deserved. We really appreciate you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.